I'm holding in the palm of my hand what looks a bit like a small circular box of mints. It's hard not to think of what is probably the most unsettling stage violence in the whole of Shakespeare, the blinding of Gloucester in King Lear.
Out, vile jelly!
The inscription tells me it's the right eye of Edward Oldcorn.
How can a single object unlock the story of Shakespeare's restless world? A new series with Neil MacGregor on BBC Radio 4.
Thank you very much indeed, and I have the greatest of great pleasures to invite Neil MacGregor, Director of the British Museum, to our second plenary here at the 38th International Feature Conference. Neil was responsible for the latest series in the Shakespeare Unlocked presentation for the BBC, and was, of course, the author and creator of A History of the World in 100 Objects. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Neil MacGregor, who will be interviewed by Robert Kettridge.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was, as you will have realised, that was the TV trail for Shakespeare's Restless World, which was the latest series that the documentaries team here made with Neil in the British Museum, and we'll come on to talk about that as we go. Just a few more words of introduction for Neil. Many of you will know him. Distinguished art historian, former director of the National Gallery in London, and most recently, of course, the director of the British Museum. And in 2010, 2 years ago, the documentaries team here and Neil and his colleagues at the museum came together to work on the series Simon mentioned, A History of the World in 100 Objects, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. I don't know whether all of you will have heard the programmes. Some of you by now might have come across it more through the book, which has been published here and also translated and published in quite a few other countries, from Germany to South Korea. Just very briefly, A History of the World in 100 Objects was 100 short 15-minute programmes in which Neil set out ambitiously to tell the whole story of the development of human civilization and what makes us human through 100 objects in the collections of the British Museum. And I think it's fair to say it became something of a phenomenon. Just before we came, I checked the latest download figures. They're still going, I'm told, at 750,000 a month, which is quite impressive, given it hasn't been on air for quite a while, although it is currently playing on WNYC in New York, where they've reached Object 91, the ship's chronometer from HMS Beagle. But there have been 27 million downloads throughout the world so far, so it was something which we hadn't quite, I think, any of us experienced in that way before. But I thought we thought the Features Conference would be an opportunity to invite Neil, who comes from his perspective as an art historian, a very distinguished director of important institutions, someone who'd made television series before, particularly when you were director of the National Gallery, to talk a bit about radio. And this session is entitled Imaginative Journey, What Only Radio Can Do. So that's our theme, Neil. But before we get into that, I mean, what role has, before you came to work in radio, what was your experience of radio? What has radio meant to you?
Well, I think, like everybody growing up in this country, in my generation, it was part of childhood with stories, of course. I mean, it was very much stories and the news, but children's stories. And growing up in Scotland, that meant stories about Glasgow, where I lived, told on the radio. So every day you were part of a story world that was there from as long as I can remember, and then news. And then the ideas, rather like all Scottish professional families, ambitious to be serious. So the Brains Trust figured quite a lot. And I don't know whether anyone really understood it, but we listened. but as a place for ideas and news. And then later on, like everybody, of course, it became music as well. But I think the idea of a community of people listening to the same stories was very early on.
Okay.
Very early on.
Let's come on to History of the World. I mean, I think when we announced the series of History of the World in 100 Objects, it was commented quite widely that this seemed almost a perverse thing to try to do on radio. Everybody, or quite a lot of people, felt that this was a very visual thing, and why wasn't this on BBC television? What did you think about that?
Well, I think it goes to the very heart of what radio can do and only radio can do. And it goes, I think, very much to the notion of what history has become and the aspects of history that interest people, because a number of things are crucial to what radio can do. If you take the thing itself, what is remarkable about describing a thing rather than showing it is that the listener has to join you in the making. And I think that's the huge difference with television. That on television you can watch somebody making things. We were at the National Gallery, did quite a lot of that. But that's quite different. If you're actually describing an object, the listener has to make their own object with you. And that means they can take possession of the object in a very different way. The fact that listening allows you to own what you hear in a very different way, I think, from looking. So it's a way of engaging the listener much more specifically. The other great advantage is that I think we all now are very clear that history can't be one authoritative narrative. That wonderful phrase by Chimamanda Adichie, the Nigerian writer, about the danger of a single story, and that if we want to understand history, we need different stories. And radio uniquely, I think, allows you to be clear that a narrative is one person's narrative, because you actually hear a voice, and different voices work very differently from different opinions on the page. And I think that is one of the most important things about history on radio and discussing things on radio, that you are immediately aware that history is a compilation, a conflation of different kinds of ideas that may or may not be coherent, that will disagree, and that history is a process of different understandings and in which the listener is engaged. So I think it allows a quite different kind of historical engagement.
Okay, well, I think we've got a couple of clips to play you. I think we should hear the first one. This is from History of the World in 100 Objects, Programme 51. This is Neil talking about a Mayan relief showing a bloodletting ceremony.
I'm looking at a limestone relief carving about the size of a small coffee table. It's rectangular and it shows two human figures. A man standing holding a blazing torch over the kneeling figure of a woman. And both are elaborately costumed with wonderful extravagant headdresses. So far, so innocuous. But when I look more closely at the woman, the scene becomes horribly disconcerting, because I can see that she's pulling a rope through her tongue, and the rope contains large thorns which are piercing and lacerating her. My squeamish European eye keeps focusing on this stupefying act. But for the Maya, what would have been important was the whole scene, for this is the king and his wife together in a devotional partnership, jointly performing a ceremony that's of fundamental significance for their position and for their power.
One of the things I like in that clip is you describing the relief being about the size of a small coffee table. And I think somebody pointed out that one of Neil's techniques of description is sort of bathos. You'll get some amazing treasure from the British Museum, and Neil will inform you that it's about the size of a mango. And that was part of the way of trying to sort of seize the objects to convey them. I mean, there it is, behind us. But I suppose the point of the series is it's nice to have the visual and it's nice to have the image, and we did have a wonderful website which you can still look at, in which you can zoom into the objects and look at them in great detail. But the point of the programs and the descriptions of the programs is to try to imaginatively appropriate them in a different way, I think.
Yes, I think I don't know what you feel sort of looking at this object, but it's much less disturbing, I think, than an account of what's actually happening. I think it's much easier to, because you have to imagine the pain of that rope with the thorns coming through the tongue. It's almost, it's difficult to imagine it without physically wincing. Looking somehow distances it very remarkably. It's that there's an enormous emotional difference between the engagement through the ear and through the eye, and oddly, the ear, I think, is much stronger. And what we were trying to do in the program was to talk about what these objects mean for the world in which they are. That was the point of the history. Not to talk about it as a work of art made by one artist, as his expression or her expression, but as what this means for society at large. And that means that I think if you start, that's much easier through an object, of course, than through anything else, because the object has clearly to be seen by people and conceived in a whole thought world. But it allows a set of questions immediately once you're into that notion of why would anybody put themselves through this pain? And why is this pain essential to the relationship between the king and the queen? What kind of society requires that? But also, what is the proper or the improper role of pain in public society? And how do we look about it, talk about it? So you move into the idea, I think. The idea is that the object arises very much more quickly in radio. And having got into them, you can then pursue them on radio in a way that in television you can't.
No, I mean, that's what, exactly. I mean, it's in television, I guess, or in a visual medium, the images would absolutely dominate, whereas I think really what the series is about is what you've just said. It is the trying to imaginatively enter different thought worlds, often quite strange ones, as you point to a European eye or a European ear. And in the end, it's the idea, not the object, which you're really getting at.
And I think if you think of this object, again, on television, you wouldn't be allowed just to look at, well, no television producer would be able just to leave an object, this object, for 10 minutes on the screen. It's just not possible. Or at least it is possible, but it's unthinkable. And which I think is also quite problematic, quite interesting. And what that means is that you couldn't, on television, keep this object, this idea, this notion of the pain of this physical experience at the front of your head, because the camera would be taking it through landscape. There would almost certainly be somebody dressed up as a Maya king, rather unconvincingly. We'd be looking at other ones. You can't keep the intensity of engagement. But the only question that matters is what kind of society is it that requires its rulers to go through this kind of ritual of pain so intense that it produces hallucinations, and in public. And that really is worth thinking about. But you can't keep thinking about it on television. You just won't be allowed to. And it's why I think radio at the moment is such an extraordinarily important medium for the serious thinking of the big historical questions about how society functions and what society demands, because you can't keep focusing on the one central idea in a way that the television precludes.
Well, let's just have a that's queued up something. Let's have a look at something else. I'm going to slightly change the order in which we play things in, which I hope isn't going to cause any problems at the back, because we showed at the beginning the TV trailer for the recent Shakespeare series, but before History of the World was broadcast, there were a couple of rather striking television trails for those, and I think they rather show how television might have tackled these sorts of topics if we can play the bull leaper in. This was broadcast, I think the first time this was, oh, here it is.
Man versus beast. Eye meets black beady eye. The real beast, however, the one to be conquered, lies not ahead, but within.
A History of the World in 100 Objects. Coming soon to BBC Radio 4.
Well, when I first saw that, I thought, gosh, these are very simple radio essays, but that seemed quite amazing. I think actually the advertising company that made those, because there was no pre-existing film as would be made for a television series, I think it rather liberated them actually to have a go.
It did make me very glad we weren't doing it on television, I must say. And I was quite startled when several people said that you didn't look like yourself at all. but as you say, I think the fact that there was no image forced the advertisers to imagine something, which is, of course, the whole point. That this is in fact, it's about that size. And when you look at it, it's Minoan, it's from Crete, and it's actually a very badly made little object which bubbles and bursts and flakes. It's a very unheroic object, but of course it raises all these fascinating questions about what's going on in this kind of ritual, and how you make the object. The fact that it is done without the image allows everyone to imagine at home what bull leaping would be, what it means, and takes you into that kind of fantasy world.
Let me just talk about the words, because as you can hear, these programs are essay-like. They are radio essays. There are lots of words in them. Was that? I think everybody who approaches radio for the first time has to, particularly who's used to either a written medium or a televisual language, has to think about words and think about radio as the orality of radio as a speaking medium and a speaking voice. Was that something that struck you, that you had to think about?
This was where, for me, not having worked in radio before, working with the BBC was as a rather a shock, because having been very used to writing for publication, to realize how different writing for speaking was. And of course writing to include the other voices, I won't come to that later, the need for the other voices and how their voices work, but the way information needs to be presented differently in speech from on the page, the number of times you need to repeat things like place, date, whatever, which you don't in a book because we're all trained to scan back. And of course the tone. And in fact, very oddly, when we were turning the script back into a text for a book, or into a text for a book, to realize how odd it would look just to have the spoken word. And I think that's, for me, that was the great discovery, that the language is so different, spoken and written to be spoken. But that's where working with the BBC teams was so interesting, and having the script sent back with marks in the margin and could do better sort of things written. They're quite severe about all that, until eventually we were trained up. But that was coming from outside radio. I think for all of us at the BM, the British Museum, it was a team of us, of course, team of curators working on this project. I think that really was one of the most interesting things to learn, how different that text and that kind of writing is.
And the programs, of course, were quite scripted, but they would also, the producers would often invite you just to be at the museum with the object in front of you and to more spontaneously, although I'm sure it was carefully prepared, to talk about it. And that's a different technique. And we've got a clip, actually, not from History of the World, but from a series Neil made with us just a little bit before that about Iran. Do you just want to introduce this clip? This is you in Isfahan, I think.
Yes, it was a moment when we still hoped that relations with Iran might warm up. And the British Museum was doing a great deal with the colleagues in Tehran. And I was asked to do a series of little postcards from around Tehran. And the idea was to capture aspects of Iran, from Iran, that would say something about what it meant to be an Iranian, see the world from the point of view of Iran. And one of those, of course, is in Isfahan, this great capital city built around 1600, which Europeans were astounded by. And in the middle of the great square is the mosque, put up in the 1620s, the Lutfallah Mosque. So it's the same date as the great Baroque things in Rome. But of course, the only decoration inside this great building is Quranic text. And the whole building inside is covered in Quranic text. And the idea of these great public spaces without any image, but just the word, is one thing I think is really essential in that great decorative tradition that we wanted to talk about.
As the light falls through the lattice windows, the words seem to move. The whole space seems to be shaped by the word, seems to be shaped for the word. There's only one part of this extraordinary golden dancing building that doesn't have words visible in it. That is the mihrab, the niche showing the direction of Mecca, much more densely, deeply decorated with arabesques and a powerful green tree. But when you walk into the mihrab, you see that actually there is an inscription even here. The rest of the building, of course, everything is in Arabic, the Arabic of the Quran. Here, there's an inscription in Persian, and it reads, "The work of a poor, humble man in need of God's mercy, Muhammad Reza, son of Master Hussein, builder of Isfahan," the architect of this astonishing building.
And I think that's something that I think all of us here enjoy about radio, that, again, without the pictures, without the visual images, the mental pictures, the acoustic in a room, in a space, the way the sound moves, the hush of the voice because it's a religious, but all of those things, they create very immediate images.
They do, and they allow, well, because they allow the listener to make their own image. But what is also good about this kind of technique is that the radio technique, it's always about how the public is involved and the response. And I think in terms of the history of things and history through things, that is more and more what people want to talk about and think about in current understandings of history. One of the, I don't know whether you'd agree, I think one of the very interesting developments of politics in terms of identity politics is that in the last generation, 2 generations, communities have tended to define themselves more and more through objects and things than used to be the case. In the 19th century, if you wanted to talk about what it meant to be Irish or Polish, what you talked about was music, folklore, dance, poetry. in the world since the Second World War, identity is very much about cultural objects and things. And things are becoming invested with many meanings, but largely meanings that define one selected identity. And it's why I think this medium of radio that can evoke responses and invite different readings and different meanings is so important, because the story of an object through time, the biography of an object, is a very interesting way of tracing how societies view themselves, what they make of the object, and how they respond to it, and different readings of the same object. And I think this is something that, again, is very hard on television, for reasons that, partly because television doesn't focus on ideas like that, but the way in which, for instance, the way Japan has tried to define itself through its cultural history, through objects that it uses, then reinvents and returns. So those are ideas that I think for all of us to understand are very important. And it takes it away from the maker of the object and turns it into how society goes on thinking about itself and goes on reinventing itself.
And I think that's one of the things the programme's deliberately set out to do, to try to, through the use of all sorts of other contributors and other perspectives, was to show how around the objects there is a very alive community of inquiry, which is ongoing and never-ending, actually.
Well, it's not just the obvious issues of where particular cultural objects belong, but what kind of history people want to construct for themselves, and debate that, and that it's constantly reinterpreted. And I think the other difficult thing we found about writing this was writing in a way the fact that we were told very firmly by the BBC that, of course, we needed to write it in chunks so that it could be done in different places with different acoustic, which would liven things up. And then we had the outside voices we wanted as well, so writing in and out of them, and then coming back to the object at various points. But it really was, I think, the idea of leaving something unresolved for the listener themselves to go on thinking about what this object might mean. And the form, the medium of radio, I think, is really uniquely adapted to that.
We're sort of touching on it. I do just want to talk a little bit about how the relationship between the BBC and the British Museum worked out, and the partnership. I mean, it's certainly true, I think, for radio producers that we tend to be used to working in very individual ways, and to really being almost solely the authors of our own programs. And I think from our perspective, one of the interesting challenges of this series was to work so closely and so intensively with you, but also with the institution behind you, with curators, with experts, with your researchers as well as our own researchers, and it led to for us a completely new way of working. And how was it for the museum?
Well, we've never had a partnership of this sort ever. I mean, there have been many, and particularly on this scale. It was quite ambitious to start the first partnership on 100 programs. But what was really valuable for us, I think, was to have somebody really challenging what the curatorial narrative was and the tone of that curatorial narrative. All curators are used to writing about their object, presenting their scholarship. And they normally do that pretty well autonomously. An editor perhaps to suggest that the order be changed or whatever, or something more explained. But broadly, what they say is what appears. To have things come back from the BBC saying this isn't interesting enough, or can we say this is the most important event of the 16th century, or whatever, you can imagine. And the huge reluctance of the curatorial team to avoid saying perhaps it may be that, or most probably made in such and such, to move something to something that could sound like a fairly straightforward statement of facts, when in fact it's usually very hard to know these things with confidence, and to present them as having significance enough to persuade the listener not to switch off. And normally, if you've actually bought the book or got the periodical off the shelf, the reader will stick with you. We weren't used, I think, to the threat of just being switched off. And that's a wonderful discipline for curators.